The first thing I noticed about Boone Island Lighthouse was how alone it felt. I had taken a small boat from York, Maine, just 6 miles out into the Atlantic, and yet, the instant my feet hit the rocky shore, the rest of the world seemed to vanish. There was nothing but wind, water, and the towering white column of the lighthouse, standing like a silent sentinel against the endless sea. The station was automated now, but the Coast Guard still hired caretakers to maintain the structure, check the light, and keep the place from falling apart. That was my job. The man I was replacing, Gordon Pratt, met me at the dock with a firm handshake and a face that looked far older than his years. He was in his late 40s, but his skin was leathered and his hair was graying in a way that suggested he had seen things he didn't want to talk about. "Everything you need to know is in the station log," he said. His voice was calm but clipped, as if he wanted to get off the island as quickly as possible. "Any advice?" I asked, trying to keep it light. Gordon gave me a look that made my stomach tighten. Then he pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from his coat pocket. "You follow the rules. Don't break them, not for any reason." He hesitated, then added, "And never, ever open the door after midnight." With that, he stepped into the boat, and within moments, he was gone. I stood there for a long time, watching the boat fade into the distance. The air felt colder now. The lighthouse loomed over me, its beacon rotating slowly, flashing across the sea. The isolation was suffocating. I spent my first day exploring the tiny scrap of land that would be my home for the next 3 months. The station consisted of the lighthouse itself, a small keeper's quarters built of stone, and a shed stocked with supplies. The generator hummed quietly, keeping the lights on and the radio operational. Everything seemed in order. Then I found the station logbook. I had expected maintenance notes, weather patterns, and shipping schedules. Instead, what I found was a list of rules, typed neatly on a page, laminated, and taped to the wall of the keeper's quarters. Rules for Boone Island Lighthouse. 1. Check the light every sunset and sunrise. 2. Keep the generator running at all times. 3. Do not leave the lighthouse between midnight and dawn. 4. If you hear tapping on the windows, ignore it. 5. If the radio picks up voices, turn it off immediately. 6. Never open the door after midnight. 7. If the beacon goes out at night, hide in the keeper's quarters until sunrise. 8. Once a week, leave food at the southern rock outcrop. Do not watch to see what takes it. I read the list 3 times, my fingers running over the laminated surface. At first, I assumed it was a joke, something left over from the days before the lighthouse was automated, but then I remembered Gordon's face. He hadn't been joking. That first night, I locked the doors. I sat in the quarters, listening to the wind howl outside, telling myself that everything was normal. Just the waves, just the wind, just the groaning of an old structure bracing against the cold. And then, around 2 a.m., I heard the tapping. It was light at first. Just a soft, rhythmic sound against the window of the quarters. Tap. 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 I told myself it was the wind, some loose wire or cable shifting in the storm. But then it moved. The tapping started at the front window. Then it was at the side window, then at the back door. Slow. Intentional. As if someone, was walking around the building, checking each entrance. I gripped the logbook so tightly my knuckles turned white. The tapping didn't stop for nearly an hour. Then, just before dawn, I heard something far worse. A whisper, just beyond the front door. A voice. Low, muffled, almost familiar. "Let me in." I sat frozen in my chair, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't move, didn't speak. Then, "Let me in." This time, the voice was clearer. It sounded exactly like Gordon. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think I'll sleep at all. The morning light didn't bring comfort. It just made the lighthouse look older, more worn, like something long abandoned that refused to fall apart completely. I hadn't slept. The whispering at the door had stopped around 4 a.m., but even after that, I couldn't close my eyes. Every time I tried, my mind replayed that voice, Gordon's voice. but I knew it hadn't been him. He was probably halfway to shore by then. I went outside just after sunrise, my boots crunching against the damp, rocky ground. The sea was calm, deceptively peaceful, stretching out in every direction. Boone Island had no trees, no grass, just stone and wind, the lighthouse its only true feature. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined everything. Lack of sleep, isolation, paranoia. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me all night. And then I saw it. At the southern edge of the island, near the jagged rocks where the waves crashed hardest, something had been left for me. A single fish, freshly caught, its scales still wet, its body split open from mouth to tail. The guts had been carefully removed and placed beside it, forming a small, almost deliberate pile. My stomach turned. Rule number 8 came rushing back to me. Once a week, leave food at the southern rock outcrop. Do not watch to see what takes it. I had assumed the food was for seagulls, or maybe a tradition among keepers. But now I wasn't so sure. Because if I was supposed to leave food there, then who had left this for me? I forced myself to go inside, pushing the logbook to the back of my mind. There was work to do, checking the fuel levels, ensuring the beacon was operational, logging weather conditions. I focused on my tasks, pushing through the exhaustion. By midday, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the island. It moved too fast, faster than any normal sea mist should, like it had been waiting just offshore. Within minutes, I couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. The lighthouse disappeared into the haze. And then came the tapping. Not on the windows this time. On the glass of the lantern room at the very top of the lighthouse. I froze. I was in the keeper's quarters. There was no way anyone could be up there. The only way into the lantern room was through a single locked hatch, and the only key was in my pocket. Tap. 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 I forced myself to move, gripping the railing as I climbed the spiral staircase. Each step creaked under my weight. My pulse pounded in my ears. The closer I got to the top, the more I felt like I was walking towards something that didn't want to be seen. I reached the hatch, hesitating for only a moment before turning the key. I pushed it open. The lantern room was empty. The light rotated as usual, sweeping through the fog. Everything was normal. No sign of anyone. No footprints. No disturbance. I exhaled and turned to go back down. Then I saw it. Pressed against the outside of the glass, barely visible in the swirling fog, a handprint. A single, perfectly formed handprint, far too large to be human. It was facing inward. As if something had been watching me from the outside. I didn't go outside again for the rest of the day. The fog stayed thick well into the night, clinging to the island like a living thing. I double-checked every lock, bolted every door. I considered boarding up the windows, but I knew that wouldn't stop the sound. At 2:47 a.m., the tapping started again. It moved from window to window, slow and methodical. I sat in the dark, gripping the logbook, forcing myself not to move. Then, just like the night before, came the voice. It wasn't Gordon's this time. It was my own. Let me in. The words slid under the door, curling into the room like fingers. Perfectly calm. Perfectly familiar. I pressed my hands over my ears, refusing to listen. Then came a single, deliberate knock. I glanced at the clock. 3:03 a.m. The knock came again. A single, steady rhythm. Not asking. Not demanding. Just waiting. I closed my eyes. The knock continued for exactly 2 minutes. And then, just like before, it stopped. I didn't sleep. I don't think I ever will again. I spent the morning forcing myself to complete my usual rounds, checking the beacon, the generator, and the fuel reserves, anything to pretend that last night had not happened, but the moment I stepped outside, I knew that reality was not going to give me that luxury. The fog had not lifted. It was supposed to, it always did, but now, even in the full light of day, it clung to the island like something alive, something that had decided to stay. I I could barely see the edge of the rocky shore, only the immediate ground before me, and in every direction beyond that, there was nothing but an endless wall of swirling gray. The sea should have been audible, the crashing of waves against the jagged rocks, the occasional call of a distant seagull, but instead, there was silence, thick and unnatural, as though the fog had swallowed sound itself. I tried to convince myself it was just an unusual weather pattern, that perhaps I was overreacting, but I knew better, because as I stood there, staring into the dense mist, I saw something move. It was distant, little more than a shadow in the thick gray, shifting slowly between the layers of fog, but I could see it clearly enough to know that it was not my imagination. It wasn't just drifting like the mist, wasn't bending with the wind, it was moving with purpose, gliding, weaving, and then it stopped. I felt the air grow heavier, the pressure of something watching me, and before I could think, I turned back inside and slammed the door behind me, my breath coming hard and fast, my hand trembling as I locked the deadbolt, as if that would somehow keep me safe. I stood there for a long time, listening, waiting, but the only thing I could hear was the humming of the generator, the steady turning of the lighthouse beacon, the sound of my own heartbeat hammering against my ribs. I stayed inside for hours, watching the fog from the small window of the keeper's quarters, trying to see if the shape would return, but if it was still out there, it had decided to stay hidden. My body ached with exhaustion, my mind felt raw, but I knew I would not be able to sleep, not as long as the fog remained, not as long as I felt that weight in the air, the unshakable sense that something was just beyond my sight, waiting. By nightfall, the fog was still there, thick as ever, but something else had changed, the silence had deepened. The wind had died completely. The ocean was gone, as though the entire world had been muffled, leaving only the steady rotation of the beacon above, the mechanical whirring of its gears the only proof that time was still passing. I forced myself to sit at the small wooden table, staring at the logbook, my fingers running absently over the list of rules. They had seemed ridiculous at first, but now I knew better, now I understood that they were not warnings, they were instructions for survival. I kept glancing at the clock, watching the minutes crawl toward midnight, waiting for the tapping to start again, waiting for the voice, waiting for the knock. My breath was shallow, every sound amplified in the dead air, and when the first tap finally came, I flinched so hard I knocked over my chair. It was slow, deliberate, starting at the front window before shifting to the back, then the side, circling the building in that same patient rhythm as the night before. I did not move, did not breathe, gripping the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles went white. Then the voice came, low and calm, slipping beneath the door as if it had been waiting for this moment. "Let me in." It was my voice again. I clenched my teeth, squeezed my eyes shut, but it did not stop. "Let me in." The whisper coiled around me, wrapping itself in my ears, curling into my skull. "Let me in." It wasn't pleading. It wasn't demanding. It was waiting, testing, feeling for any sign of weakness. I forced my gaze toward the clock, toward the ticking second hand, watching it creep toward 3:03 a.m., knowing it would end if I could just hold out a little longer. The knock came, just like the night before, slow and steady, just once every few seconds, perfectly timed, perfectly patient. It lasted exactly 2 minutes. Then, just like that, it was gone. The moment the knock stopped, the silence rushed back in, deeper than before, like the world had been hollowed out. My breath was shaking, my vision swimming with exhaustion, but I did not move, did not dare to break the fragile stillness. Then, from somewhere deep in the fog outside, I heard a sound I had not heard before, something shifting against the rock, something moving, something far heavier than a footstep. And then, just as the first trace of dawn crept through the mist, something outside let out a long, slow exhale. I did not sleep. I will not sleep. The fog did not lift with the dawn. I had hoped that sunlight would burn it away, but when I stepped outside, the world remained swallowed in thick, swirling gray. It was denser than before, pressing against my skin like a damp, heavy hand, muting the air so completely that even my own footsteps sounded distant. The ground beneath my boots was slick with moisture, the rocks glistening as though they had just surfaced from the sea. The wind had not returned, and without it, the island felt suffocated, trapped beneath an unmoving sky. The ocean should have been loud, the waves should have crashed against the shore, but there was nothing, only the faint hum of the generator and the slow, rhythmic pulse of the rotating beacon. I forced myself to complete my morning tasks, but my hands were unsteady, my muscles weak from exhaustion. My body was running on nothing but nerves, every step weighted with the knowledge that I was not alone, that something unseen was still watching, waiting. I made my way toward the southern rock outcrop, knowing what I had to do, knowing I could not ignore the rules. My breath came slow and measured as I approached, and just as I feared, another offering had been left in the same place as before. This time it was not a fish. This time it was something I did not recognize, something pale and slick, shaped like a coiled length of flesh, like something that had been peeled from the body of a thing that should not exist. My stomach clenched, my pulse hammering against my ribs as I crouched down, forcing myself not to look away, forcing myself to understand that whatever had left this had done so deliberately, that this was not a mistake, not something the tide had carried in. This was an exchange, and I had not yet upheld my end of the bargain. I reached into my pocket, fingers brushing against the small bundle of dried meat I had prepared the night before. My throat was dry as I placed it onto the rocks, feeling ridiculous, feeling terrified, feeling like I was feeding something that should never be fed. I did not linger. I did not look back. I walked away with my heart slamming against my ribs, knowing that somewhere behind me, something was waiting to take what I had left. The rest of the day passed in a haze, time slipping through my fingers in a way that felt unnatural. The fog made it impossible to tell how many hours had gone by, the sun hidden behind thick, unmoving clouds, leaving only a dim, unchanging gray that stretched from morning into evening. My movements became mechanical, routine, a desperate attempt to cling to normalcy, but I knew it was futile. I could feel it pressing in on me, the weight of the island, the feeling that I was walking through something's territory, that I was an intruder in a place that had never been meant for me. By the time night fell, the exhaustion was unbearable, but I knew better than to let my guard down. I locked the doors, bolted the windows, and sat at the table with the logbook open in front of me, tracing my fingers over the rules as though they could protect me. I counted the seconds as they passed, waiting, knowing what was coming, knowing that it would start again the moment the clock neared 3 a.m. And just as before, the first sound came at exactly 2:47 a.m., soft, deliberate tapping, moving in a slow, patient circle around the keeper's quarters. I forced myself to remain still, my body locked in place as the sound traveled from window to window, then to the back door, then to the front. Then the voice came. "Let me in." It was my voice again, perfectly calm, perfectly steady, slipping beneath the door like a breath of cold air. I clenched my teeth, pressing my hands against my temples, forcing myself not to react, not to listen. "Let me in." The whisper did not change, did not plead, did not demand. It simply waited. The knock followed soon after, slow and deliberate, a single beat against the door every few seconds. I focused on the clock, watching the second hand crawl toward 3:03 a.m., knowing that it would end if I could just hold out, knowing that it had always ended before. But this time, it did not stop. The knock continued past 3:04, past 3:05, stretching longer than it ever had before. My stomach clenched, my breath coming fast and shallow as I realized that the pattern had changed, that something was different, that the rules were shifting around me. And then, from somewhere deep beneath the island, I heard something else. A sound that was not the knock, not the voice, not the tapping against the glass. It was low, heavy, and distant, vibrating through the stone beneath my feet, something impossibly large moving beneath the waves. Something breathing. My skin went cold. My body locked in place. The knock at the door stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. The deep, rumbling breath continued, slow and deliberate, rising from the depths, sending a tremor through the floor, through the walls, through my bones. I did not move. I did not blink. I did not breathe. And then, just before the first light of dawn, the breath stopped. Something had surfaced. And it was waiting. The moment the breath stopped, I felt it. A presence. A weight in the air that hadn't been there before. It wasn't sound, wasn't movement, it was just a knowing, an undeniable certainty that something enormous, something alive, was no longer beneath the water but above it, watching me from just beyond the fog. I didn't move. I sat frozen in the keeper's quarters, hands gripping the edges of the logbook, my breath shallow and uneven, my ears straining against the silence, waiting for something, anything, to happen, but nothing did. Outside, the fog was thicker than ever, pressing against the windows like a solid wall, a smothering, suffocating presence that refused to lift. I waited for the light of dawn to break through it, to burn it away, but it never did. The hours crawled past in an unbroken haze of gray, leaving me disoriented, untethered, unable to tell where one moment ended and another began. I checked the clock, certain that it had to be well past sunrise, but the hands moved slower than they should have, dragging through the hours with an unnatural sluggishness, as if time itself had begun to unravel. I turned on the radio, desperate for some proof that the outside world still existed, but the only sound that came through the static was a low, humming drone, something deep and distant, vibrating through the speaker like the echo of a voice too large to understand. I shut it off and forced myself outside. The air was damp, heavy with the weight of the fog, clinging to my skin like something living. I moved slowly, keeping my steps light, careful not to disturb the unnatural quiet that had settled over the island. The sea was invisible beyond the mist, but I could hear it now, not the usual crash of waves, not the distant call of gulls, but something else, something beneath the surface, shifting, moving. I didn't go near the southern rock outcrop. I knew I should, knew I had to follow the rules, but I couldn't. Not today. Not with whatever had risen from the deep still waiting. I kept my head down and focused on my tasks. I checked the fuel levels, cleaned the glass of the beacon, logged the weather, fog, dense, unbroken. My hands shook as I wrote, the pencil dragging uneven lines across the page, my breath coming shallow and quick, my body screaming at me to leave, to get off the island, to run. But there was nowhere to run. There was only the lighthouse, only the fog, only the slow, rhythmic movement of something I could not see, something I did not want to see. The hours stretched on. The fog did not lift. The presence did not leave. As night fell, I locked the doors, bolted the windows, sat in the same chair I had sat in for the past 3 nights, gripping the logbook as though it could protect me. The routine had not changed, but something had. The tapping came earlier this time, starting just after midnight, slow, methodical, circling the building in careful, deliberate steps. I held my breath, waiting for the voice, waiting for the knock, waiting for the thing outside to test me again. But it didn't. Instead, something else knocked from below. The floorboards shuddered beneath me, the impact sending a jolt up through my legs, through my chest, through my skull. I lurched back, the chair scraping against the wooden planks as another knock came, this one deeper, heavier, vibrating through the foundation like a pulse. The knocking at the door had always been human, always measured, deliberate, but this was different. This was felt more than heard, something vast and ancient pressing against the island itself. Then the voice returned. But it wasn't outside the door. It was beneath the floor. "Let me in." The words crawled through the wood, sliding between the cracks, slipping into the room like damp air. It was my voice again, but distorted, stretched, like something was wearing it, something that did not understand how words were supposed to sound. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, my hands gripping the edge of the table as the voice came again. "Let me in." It was closer this time. Then the first board split. A hairline crack ran along the floor, the wood groaning beneath an unseen weight, something pressing up from below, testing the barrier between us. I scrambled backward, my pulse hammering, my thoughts tangled in a blur of panic and disbelief. There was nothing beneath the lighthouse. Just stone. Just the island. Unless that was a lie. The crack widened. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The air shifted, the presence withdrew, the island exhaled. The fog outside remained, the silence thick and unbroken, but whatever had been pressing against the floor, whatever had been trying to push through, had retreated. I stood there for a long time, staring at the fractured wood, at the splintered line that now ran through the heart of the keeper's quarters, at the proof that something had been down there, something deep, something waiting. I did not sleep. I do not think I ever will again. Morning came, or at least, I assumed it did. The fog had not lifted, the sky remained an unbroken stretch of gray, and the light that managed to seep through the thick mist was weak and directionless, casting no shadows, giving no sense of time. The crack in the floor was still there, a jagged line of splintered wood stretching from the center of the keeper's quarters toward the back wall, the only proof that last night had been real, that something had pressed against the foundation of the lighthouse and tried to force its way inside. I stood over it, staring down into the darkness beneath the split boards, but there was nothing to see, only the damp, unsteady blackness of the void below. The island was solid rock. I knew that. I had seen the maps, had read the geological reports. There was nothing beneath the lighthouse. But I could hear it breathing. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a slow, deliberate rhythm rising from beneath the floor, filtering through the cracks, curling up into the stagnant air like the remnants of an unseen tide. It was deep, impossibly deep, the kind of sound that settled into your bones, that made the walls feel thinner, the ground feel less stable, as if everything around me was no longer built of stone and wood but something far more fragile. I stepped back, my pulse hammering in my ears, forcing myself to move, forcing myself to break the paralysis that had taken hold of me since waking. I needed to do something, anything, to convince myself that I still had control, that I was still the keeper of this place and not just another presence trapped within it. I went outside, but the fog was worse than before. It pressed against my skin, clung to my clothes, damp and suffocating, turning the air thick and unmoving, a weight I had to push against with every step. The sound of the ocean had disappeared completely, as if the water had been swallowed by the mist, leaving only the unnatural silence that had become as much a part of this island as the lighthouse itself. I knew I had tasks to complete, routines to maintain, but I found myself moving toward the southern rock outcrop instead, my body pulled forward by something I could not explain. I didn't want to go there, didn't want to see what had been left for me this time, but the rules were clear, and I had already broken too many. The moment I reached the edge of the island, I stopped. The offering was waiting, placed in the same spot as before, deliberate, expected. But this time, it was not a fish, not something torn from the sea. It was a hand. The skin was pale and smooth, the fingers long and slender, the nails blackened and cracked. It did not look severed, there was no sign of violence, no exposed bone or ragged flesh, just a hand, resting on the rock like it had been set there gently, like it had been placed, waiting to be taken. My stomach lurched, my breath catching in my throat as I took a step back, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, to turn away, to not complete whatever ritual I had unknowingly begun. But I didn't run. I reached into my pocket with a hand that was no longer steady and pulled out the dried meat I had brought, the meager offering that felt so utterly insignificant in comparison. My fingers trembled as I set it beside the hand, my breath shallow and uneven as I forced myself to turn and walk away, each step feeling heavier than the last, the weight of unseen eyes pressing into my back, the fog shifting around me as if something inside it had moved. I did not stop. I did not look back. I locked the doors behind me and sat at the table with the logbook open before me, staring at the list of rules, tracing each word with my fingertip as if they could still protect me, as if they had ever protected me. The hours passed in slow, dragging increments, my body wound so tightly with exhaustion that it hurt, but I knew sleep would not come, knew that if I closed my eyes, I would hear it again, the voice, the knock, the thing breathing beneath the floor. I waited, staring at the clock, watching the minutes crawl toward midnight, toward the inevitable. And then, at exactly 2:47 a.m., the knocking returned. It was different this time. Slower. Heavier. The weight of it shook the walls, sent vibrations through the floor, rattled the glass of the windows. It moved in the same pattern as before, circling the quarters, testing each surface, each barrier, but this time it did not stop at the door. It did not stop at the windows. It continued upward, step by step, rising toward the lantern room, toward the beacon. I heard the metal stairs groan under an unseen weight, heard the hatch above creak against the strain of something pressing against it, pushing, waiting to be let in. And then the voice came. But this time, it was not my voice. It was someone else's. It was Gordon's. "Let me in." The words were slow, thick, heavy with something that was not human. I clenched my teeth, my breath locked in my chest, my body frozen in place. "Let me in." It was above me now, on the other side of the hatch, waiting, pressing against the metal, its weight making the beams groan, making the floor beneath my feet vibrate. Then, in the silence that followed, something clicked. The beacon went out. Darkness swallowed the room, the last trace of light disappearing as the steady rotation of the beacon above stopped. The lighthouse had gone blind. And I was no longer alone. The light was gone. The only thing left was darkness, thick and absolute, pressing against me from every direction, filling the keeper's quarters with a suffocating weight that made the air feel damp and stale. The beacon had never gone out before, not once, not in all the records I had read, not in all the years this lighthouse had stood against the sea. But now, the room was plunged into blackness, the steady, rhythmic pulse of the rotating light replaced by a silence so deep it swallowed every other sound. I did not move. I did not breathe. I sat frozen in place, my fingers gripping the edges of the logbook as if it could somehow tether me to reality, as if it could protect me from what had just happened. The knocking had stopped, but I knew better than to think that meant it was over. Something had changed. The rules had shifted. The voice had not been mine this time. It had been Gordon's. I could still hear it, the way it had pressed against the metal hatch above, slow and thick, dripping with something that was not human. The fog outside remained, pressing against the windows, so dense it might as well have been stone, sealing me inside with whatever had crept up from beneath the waves. My ears strained against the silence, waiting, listening for the next sound, for the next sign that I was not alone. And then, slowly, deliberately, I heard it. Footsteps. Not from above. Not from outside. From inside the lighthouse. They were slow, unhurried, moving with a careful weight, a patience that sent ice through my veins. I did not understand how, did not know when the door had opened, if it had opened, but something was inside. I reached for the flashlight, my hands slick with sweat, my fingers slipping against the cold metal as I fumbled to switch it on. The beam cut through the dark in a thin, trembling arc, sweeping across the room, finding nothing but empty air in the cold, damp walls of the lighthouse. The footsteps had stopped. Then, from the farthest corner of the room, I heard a breath. Shallow. Measured. Not mine. I did not move. I knew, somehow, instinctively, that if I shined the light in that direction, I would see something I was not meant to see. I forced myself to stay still, my pulse hammering in my ears, my breath shallow and uneven, my muscles locked in place as if the very act of motion might shatter the fragile silence that had settled over the room. The breath did not change. It remained steady, unbroken, like something was waiting. Then the door creaked. The sound sent a spike of ice through my ribs, my grip tightening around the flashlight as I forced myself to turn, to move, to do something, but before I could react, the voice came again. Let me in. It was not Gordon's this time. It was mine again, but slower now, dragged out, like something was stretching the words, trying to mold them into the right shape, but failing. My mouth went dry, my stomach twisting itself into knots as the air grew heavier, pressing against my skin, curling around my throat like a damp, unseen hand. Let me in. The breath in the corner shifted. I did not turn the light toward it. I did not want to know what it was. Then the knocking returned. But it did not come from the door this time. It came from inside the walls. A slow, steady rhythm, dull and distant, muffled by stone, as if something was moving through the lighthouse itself, pressing against the structure from all sides, searching, testing, waiting for something to break. The first knock was at my back. The second was at the window. The third was beneath my feet. The sound moved through the space around me, circling, coiling, tightening like a noose, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The breath in the corner was gone. The presence was gone. But the light did not return. I sat in the darkness for what felt like hours, my body refusing to move, my mind unraveling, the weight of exhaustion pressing against my skull like a dull blade. The silence stretched on, unbroken, deep and infinite, and I realized, in that moment, that I was no longer certain if I was awake or dreaming. If I had ever woken up at all. Then, somewhere far below, beneath the foundation of the lighthouse, I heard something shift. And for the first time since I had arrived on Boone Island, I understood the truth. I had never been keeping watch over the lighthouse. The lighthouse had been keeping watch over something else. And now, whatever had been waiting beneath the stone had begun to rise. The silence did not break, but the island did. I felt it before I heard it, a deep tremor that ran through the stone beneath my feet, a slow, deliberate pulse like the beating of something vast and buried, something waking up. The air inside the lighthouse was thick, damp, pressing against my skin with the weight of something unseen, something that had been waiting in the dark for longer than I could comprehend. I did not move. I sat at the table with the logbook open in front of me, my fingers tracing the words, the rules, the last fragile remnants of control I had left, but I knew they meant nothing now. The light was gone. The beacon was dead. The thing beneath the island had begun to surface. I heard it breathing. It was not like the breath in the corner of the room, not like the voice outside the door, not like the whispers that had slithered through the cracks at night. This was deeper, heavier, something too large to be contained within the walls of the lighthouse, something that did not belong in this world but had been waiting just beneath its surface. I forced myself to move, my body sluggish, my limbs heavy, my breath shallow as I reached for the flashlight, knowing it would do nothing, knowing that the darkness in this place was no longer the absence of light but something alive, something hungry. The walls around me were damp. I could feel it when I touched them, the slow, seeping wetness that ran through the stone like sweat, like something was pushing through. Then, just outside the keeper's quarters, I heard the first crack. It was quiet at first, a faint, brittle sound, like eyes splitting apart beneath too much weight, but then it deepened, spread, echoed through the structure like a fault line splitting open. I turned toward the sound, my pulse hammering against my ribs, my hands slick with sweat as I pressed myself against the far wall, my mind screaming at me to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there and wait for whatever was about to come through. But there was nowhere to go. The lighthouse breathed. I felt it move, the walls flexing around me, the stone groaning like something massive was pressing against it from all sides. The floor beneath me shifted, a slow, rolling motion like the swell of an unseen tide, and then the second crack came, deeper this time, closer. And then, finally, the door opened. Not the door to the lighthouse. Not the door to the keeper's quarters. The other door. The one that should not have existed. It split through the far wall like something peeling away skin, a jagged, gaping wound in the stone, the edges slick and raw, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic beat that matched the thing beneath the island. The air that poured through it was not wind, but something heavier, thicker, filled with the scent of salt and rot and something old, something that had been buried for longer than I could comprehend. I could not see what lay beyond the opening. My flashlight was still clutched in my shaking hands, the beam cutting through the dark, but the light did not touch whatever was on the other side. It was as if it had been swallowed, consumed by something deeper, something that had never known light at all. Then, from inside the wound in the stone, the voice came again. "Let me in." It was not Gordon. It was not me. It was something else. I did not answer. I did not breathe. I stood at the edge of the room, my pulse hammering, my body locked in place as I stared into the gaping wound in the lighthouse, waiting, listening, knowing that whatever had been waiting beneath this place was no longer content to stay buried. The walls around me shuddered, the structure groaning under a weight that was not meant to exist in this world, and then, slowly, something moved. I did not see it. I only saw the absence it left behind. A shape, too large, too wrong to exist in the space beyond the opening, shifting, coiling, unfolding itself as it pressed against the threshold, testing, waiting, watching me with eyes I could not see but could feel. "Let me in." The words did not come from a mouth. They came from the walls, from the floor, from the very foundation of the island itself. I stepped back. The wound in the lighthouse widened. The walls flexed. The breath in the dark deepened. And then, just as I felt the ground beneath me begin to open, just as the stone split beneath my feet and the air around me turned to liquid, just as I felt myself being pulled toward whatever had been waiting beneath Boone Island for longer than I had been alive, the light came back on. The beacon surged to life, a blinding, searing light cutting through the dark like a knife, piercing through the fog, through the wound in the stone, through whatever had begun to crawl through. And just like that, the door slammed shut. The wound sealed. The lighthouse exhaled. And I was alone again. I did not move for a long time. The silence that followed was deeper than anything I had ever known. But I understood something now. The rules had not been meant to protect me. They had been meant to keep whatever was beneath this island from getting out. And now, the lighthouse was failing. The cracks were widening. The doors were opening. And something was waiting on the other side. The light had returned, but it had not undone what had happened. The beacon still rotated, sweeping its sterile glow across the thick, unrelenting fog, but I knew that whatever had surfaced beneath Boone Island had not disappeared. It had not been banished or sealed away. It had simply gone still, waiting, watching from the cracks in the stone. The air inside the lighthouse was thick with the lingering scent of salt and decay, the dampness in the walls deeper than before, a slow, creeping rot that had begun to spread. The wood beneath my feet was swollen and warped, the moisture rising from the floor as though the sea had begun to seep through the foundation itself. I moved through the quarters in a daze, my body sluggish, my limbs weighed down by exhaustion that had burrowed deep into my bones. The wound in the wall was gone, as if it had never existed, but I could still feel it, the space where it had been, the place where the stone had opened and something had tried to step through. I pressed my palm against the surface, felt the damp, uneven texture beneath my fingertips, the subtle, almost imperceptible vibration that ran through the structure like a pulse. The lighthouse was still breathing. The island was still shifting beneath me. I forced myself outside, but the fog had thickened. The air was suffocating, pressing against me from all sides, heavy with the weight of something unseen. The horizon had disappeared entirely, the sky and the sea swallowed in the same gray void, leaving only the immediate space around the lighthouse visible. Even the rocks at the edge of the island seemed blurred, their shapes uncertain, shifting as though they were no longer solid. I hesitated before making my way toward the southern rock outcrop, my breath shallow, my pulse an unsteady rhythm in my chest. I did not want to see what had been left for me this time, but I knew the rules, knew I had to follow them, knew I had already tested the limits of whatever had been keeping me alive. When I reached the outcrop, the offering was waiting. It was different again. No fish. No hand. Instead, something unrecognizable lay upon the stone, something wet and glistening, something that looked like it had been peeled from a body but did not belong to anything that should exist. The skin was pale, translucent, stretched too thin over something that still pulsed beneath the surface, twitching as though it was still alive. The sight of it sent ice through my veins, a deep and instinctive horror that settled in my gut, the knowledge that this was not a gift, not an exchange, but something else entirely. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the small bundle of dried meat I had brought, but I hesitated, my body locked in place by the certainty that whatever had left this had changed the rules, that the balance had shifted, that this was no longer about feeding something unseen but about something claiming me. I placed the offering down, my hands unsteady, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I turned away from the thing on the rock, refusing to look at it any longer, refusing to acknowledge what it might mean. The air around me was thick with the weight of unseen eyes, the presence of something vast and waiting pressing against my back as I made my way toward the lighthouse, forcing my feet to move, forcing myself not to run, knowing that if I did, I might not make it inside before whatever was watching decided it was done waiting. I locked the doors. I bolted the windows. I sat in the keeper's quarters with the logbook open before me, but the words meant nothing now. The rules were breaking. The lighthouse was failing. I could feel the shift in the air, the slow unraveling of whatever had been holding this place together. The knocking would come again tonight, I knew that, but I did not know what would happen when it did. I had heard my own voice outside the door. I had heard Gordon's voice above the hatch. I had felt something beneath the floor, pressing against the cracks in the wood, something deeper, older, something that had been waiting far longer than I had been here. And then, as the clock neared midnight, the knocking started. But this time, it came from inside the lighthouse. It did not move from window to window, did not circle the building in its slow, patient rhythm. It came from the stairwell, from the steps leading up to the beacon, from inside the structure itself. The sound was heavy, deliberate, the weight of something large pressing against the metal steps, each impact slow and steady, echoing through the tight, enclosed space. My breath caught in my throat. My fingers tightened around the edges of the logbook. Then the voice came, but it was not mine, not Gordon's. It was something else. Something too deep, too wet, something that did not belong in the throat of any living thing. "Let me in." The words were thick, stretched, a sound more than speech, something that echoed from within the walls themselves. The air around me grew damp, the scent of salt and rot filling my lungs as the lighthouse shuddered under the weight of something unseen. The knocking did not stop. It did not pause. It continued in its slow, deliberate rhythm, step by step, moving downward. It was coming closer. And for the first time since I had arrived on Boone Island, I realized something. The thing that had been waiting beneath the island had not been trying to get inside. It had been waiting for me to open the way. And I had. The knocking did not stop. It was no longer the slow, patient sound I had come to expect, no longer a test, no longer waiting for permission. It had become something else, a demand. The lighthouse trembled with each impact, the walls no longer solid, no longer wood and stone, but something softer, wetter, alive. The cracks in the floor had spread wide now, gaping wounds in the structure that pulsed with something beneath, something pressing upward. The air stank of salt and rot, thick with a dampness that clung to my skin like unseen fingers, a presence so massive, so vast, that I could feel it wrapping itself around me, even though I could not see it. The light was still dead. The beacon, once my only defense, had failed, its rotation halted, its power stripped away. The lighthouse had been built to contain something, to keep whatever lay beneath from breaking through, but now I understood, the cracks had been growing for longer than I had been here. Maybe longer than Gordon. Maybe longer than any of us. I had not broken it. I had only arrived at the end. I could hear it now, the deep, inhuman breath moving through the walls, a slow, patient inhalation, as if the lighthouse itself had become the lungs of something waking up. The sound reverberated through the structure, vibrating up through the floor, through my bones, through the very air itself. The knocking was no longer at the door, no longer at the hatch above. It was everywhere. And then the voice came, but it did not come from outside. It came from inside me. "Let me in." I staggered backward, my breath hitching in my throat, my fingers tightening around the logbook as though it could still protect me, as though the words on its pages still held meaning. But the rules were gone now, broken, meaningless. The walls trembled around me, the wood bending inward, reaching. The lighthouse was no longer a structure. It was a body. A shell. A skin stretched too thin over something that had been buried beneath it for far too long. And then the first tentacle came through the floor. It did not burst through, did not shatter the wood in a violent explosion. It simply slipped in, as though the cracks had never been cracks at all, but open wounds, waiting to be used. It was slick and black, glistening with something that smelled of brine and blood, its surface covered in ridges that pulsed, moved, as though they were breathing. It coiled lazily at first, curling around the base of the table, feeling its way across the room like a blind thing searching in the dark. Then came the second. The third. The fourth. I ran. I did not think. Did not hesitate. Did not stop to understand. My body moved before my mind could catch up, instinct taking over as I turned and bolted for the stairs, my feet slamming against the wood as I took them two at a time, the lighthouse shaking beneath me. The walls flexed, groaned, as though the structure was trying to close in, as though it did not want to let me leave. Something slithered along the railing just behind me, another tendril, another limb, reaching, curling, trying to grab, but I did not slow. I lunged forward, bursting into the main hall, my breath coming ragged and sharp as I stumbled toward the door. It was locked. I don't know I locked it. Maybe I hadn't. Maybe it had. The bolt was rusted in place, slick with moisture that shouldn't have been there, the wood around the frame swelling, shifting, as though something on the other side was breathing through it. I grabbed it with both hands, wrenched, pulled, slammed my shoulder against the frame, my mind racing, my heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped animal. Behind me, the tendrils had found their rhythm. They no longer searched. They reached. I felt the first one brush my ankle, a slick, unnatural touch that sent ice through my veins, an instinctive, primal horror older than thought. I kicked back, hard, heard a wet sound as it recoiled, but another had already found its way forward, wrapping itself around the leg of the chair beside me, pulling. The room was shrinking, collapsing, the walls pulsing, the floor softening, becoming part of something else. I screamed. I didn't hear it. I only felt the rawness in my throat, the desperate, useless release of air, panic turning into survival. My fingers fumbled at my belt, found the heavy rusted key Gordon had given me, the one I had never needed to use before. I jammed it into the lock, twisted so hard my wrist popped, but it turned. The door burst open, and the wind hit me like a wave. The storm had finally come. The wind roared against the lighthouse, the fog swirling in violent eddies, the rain lashing against my skin like needles. The sea was thrashing, furious, the waves hammering the rocks below with relentless force. I didn't stop to think, didn't stop to breathe. I ran. The ground beneath my feet was slick, uneven, breaking. The cracks in the lighthouse had spread to the island itself, the stones splintering, fissures splitting outward toward the sea, as though the very land beneath Boone Island had begun to collapse. I didn't know where I was going, there was nowhere to go, no boat, no way back, but I couldn't stay. The wind howled, the rain blurred my vision, and behind me, the lighthouse screamed. I turned, just for a second, just long enough to see the thing that had been hidden beneath it finally rising. The lighthouse was no longer a lighthouse. It had peeled itself open, its walls unraveling, the beacon splitting in half as something crawled out from beneath it, something vast, something endless, something that had only been using the structure as a shell. Tendrils the size of tree trunks lashed at the air, something slick and black and ridged coiling up through the cracks in the island, the remnants of the tower still clinging to its body like dead skin. The beacon still flickered, rotating in a slow, uneven rhythm, but it was no longer shining for ships. It was shining for something else. I didn't stop running. I reached the edge of the island just as the first tendril tore through the sky, and I jumped. The last thing I felt was the water swallowing me whole, the cold, crushing weight pulling me under, dragging me away from the island, away from the lighthouse, away from whatever had been buried beneath it. I kicked, fought against the tide, the salt burning my eyes, my lungs, but I kept moving, kept swimming toward the last place I had seen land, the last place I had seen safety. I don't know how long I was in the water. When I woke up, I was in a hospital in York, Maine. They told me I had been found floating miles off the coast, barely alive, clinging to a piece of driftwood from Boone Island. They told me the lighthouse had collapsed. They told me I was lucky. They were wrong. The island may be gone, but whatever was beneath it is not. And now, it no longer has a door to keep it inside.